This week in Pure Reinvention.
When I was younger, I used to think there were a lot of values. There were a lot of things that you needed to die on the hill for. Values, non-negotiables. Now I think there's few.
Episode 60, Phil Knight, Executive Director of the Food Bank Council of Michigan.
Engage, disrupt, adapt, repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious people.
Welcome to this episode of the Pure Reinvention podcast, where our mission is to create space for the unexpected by inspiring a reinvention lifestyle. This episode is sponsored by HRM Services and our friend Jody Schaefer for all of your human resource and training needs. Thank you, Jody, for your sponsorship. And for those that are interested in a sponsorship, please get a hold of us. We'd love to talk to you. Misty, Dr. Phil Knight had so many interesting stories. But I think one of the most compelling stories that I learned from him was his relationship with his board.
I think he was a good guy to talk to and share the journey of Pure Reinvention that he's gone on and taken the Food Bank Council on, because he has turned them around. And I think maybe it started with the board.
It did. And I think because of that, and as you listen for why the board is so important as a catalyst in this story, I think the other thing to be listening for is the importance of the why, that Dr. Knight has really changed the focus of the organization by asking that key question about what is the why.
In that, he's able to bring his team along. So listen for what he's done to create a culture around their why, around what they're doing, and bring everyone on board.
Misty, I've got one more little thing I'd like to say. I'd like to give a shout out to Amy Brooks of the Michigan Water Environment Association.
Hi, Amy.
Amy has been a faithful listener. Little Bird has told us about her loyal listenership. And so, Amy, we want to thank you for dedicating the time.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks for joining us. And more people, if you tell us what you're thinking, maybe we can give you a shout out on our show.
Misty, let's take a listen to this podcast.
Sounds good.
Welcome to this episode of Pure Reinvention. We're here with Dr. Phil Knight, who's the Executive Director of the Food Bank Council of Michigan. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with you.
Well, Phil, what's interesting about doing this podcast in your space, which is the Marshall Street Armory, is a reinvented space.
It absolutely is. Built in 1924 and dedicated to the service and protection of Michigan as an armory, but just repurposed, reinvented several years ago. And Mike, it was interesting when we rededicated this space to see the soldiers come back here and hear the stories of when they left and came home, and now to see this building continue to stay in the service of Michigan citizens.
I have had a chance to take a tour a couple of times, and it's always, for me, very interesting to go through the space, which used to be the old stables. I think what's really interesting is in today's world, where sometimes we think we have to bulldoze something and start over, that there is a lot of opportunity around reinvention, reinventing buildings, reinventing people, reinventing companies. And in this particular case, I want to talk to you about reinvention, because that's what you've been doing here.
Yes, it is. It is true. And it's been an exciting process so far.
So tell us a little bit about your background, Phil. Who are you, and how did you get to the position that you have today?
Thanks for having me on, because I receive this podcast every Monday, and I listen faithfully, and I encourage everyone to do the same, because you have a gift, Mike, to make us think differently. And when we think differently, we oftentimes think better. So thanks for doing this, and thanks for having me. I've been in nonprofit or advocacy work all of my career. I guess the highlights of my life have been, I say I was born in L.A., which is lower Alabama. You can tell from this accent. And I spent 9.5 years in East Africa, reinventing opportunities for people. We led projects to build the first schools in the Bavuma Islands of Lake Victoria. And these were grass huts, mud huts, grass roofs, no permanent buildings in any of the 54 islands. And you had to take everything that you built with in a boat 16 miles out to the first project. And I maintain you've really never ridden in a boat till you've ridden in a boat with a live cow.
Isn't that something?
Because you had to take what you were going to eat and feed your team. There was no electricity, so you had to take them on the hoof. And if you think getting the cow in the boat was hard, getting him out was much more difficult. Spent years in advocacy work, worked with Haley Barber at Barber Griffin and Reynolds in Washington, D.C., and fell in love with a Michigan lady, Christy, and moved to Michigan. And of course, Michigan women say that, of course you did, we're the best. And Michigan men always say you'll find out how much you love her in January. So
Yes.
I've been here for a number of years. Served with Big Brothers Big Sisters in the Michigan Capital Region, and then for a little over a year now, have served here as the Food Bank Council of Michigan as its executive director.
Phil, we've asked all of our guests the same 3 questions in 2016, and we want to kind of start out the same way so we can kind of see just what your thought process is. But of the 3 questions we've been asking our guests, the first question is, of the 5 steps in the pure reinvention process, which step do you most find yourself thinking about?
That's really hard for me to narrow it down to just one, so I might fail this part of the interview. But I think that the step about owning, after disruption, owning, because what we're probably at the Food Bank Council is we've created this disruption, and we're changing the conversation about food security and hunger. Hunger has long been woven into the fabric of our society and has become acceptable. And I find that unacceptable. And so we're changing the conversation. So when I say to people, we're about solving hunger in Michigan, I'll be honest with you, I get a lot of reactions, and most of them not positive. Oh, what do you mean solve hunger? How would you even think that that's possible? Mm-hmm. And I think that we have to change the conversation.
I want to come back and really deep dive into that, because that's really is capturing my intention here. Second question, what is your superpower?
I would have to, I should say I'm not sure that I have one, but if I had one, it would be intuition.
And then finally, since all people, all superheroes who have superpowers always have their kryptonite.
Right.
What is your kryptonite?
I'm going to say fear of failure, and let me qualify that. All of us, if you're in leadership, you're going to fail. That's just part of the gig. I think failure is just an opportunity to start over more intelligently. So that's just part of it. So when I say fear of failure, that's not what I mean. What I mean is this mission to create a food secure state is so vitally important to people, to children, to the economy of our state, that I fear that if we failed at it, it would be devastating. And devastation in my mind would be things would remain the same.
So let's now move into what I want to investigate, which is this phrase you used, changing the conversation. When you start talking about changing the conversation, my mind goes to changing the conversation outbound into the marketplace, like what you're describing. Mm-hmm. But really and truly, I wonder at times if one of our bigger challenges as leaders is changing the conversation on the inside. Can you talk about how your board of directors has responded to this changing of the conversation?
Sure. And it has been a change. Traditionally and historically, for the 40 some odd years that food banking has been around in this nation, we talked about hunger in terms of alleviation. We've talked about it in terms of management. That's not the right terms.
That's not the end goal.
No, it can't be. It has to be about solving it, about creating opportunities, getting better at what we do, and then creating partnerships that when we win, when we complete our mission, they win. Because food is not the answer to hunger. It's part of the solution, but it's not the answer. We have plenty of food.
That is a very different conversation, isn't it?
It is a very different conversation.
So if you have a board of directors who are always thinking in terms of solving symptoms, how do we get available food to the places where we need food?
Right.
How do you get them to shift to the core, which is understanding why we have hunger and understanding then how to build into the solution the answer?
Well, I think this board of directors, who are all executive directors of the 7 regional food banks in the state, they're totally vested. This is how they're investing their one handful of life. So we're all in there together. Now, the challenge for me is you can't fool them because they're professionals in this sector where a lot of nonprofit board members are not professionals.
So whatever the executive tells them, they believe. In this particular case, the executives that are on your board know.
They know. There's no fooling them.
And so it's about synchronization and alignment and focus and not knowledge.
Yes, knowledge is not the issue. They have that. Maybe wisdom that we all need, and just thinking about things differently. I have a board member, and he will say this: if we're still having this same conversation 5 years from now, then I will feel like we failed. We think about it in terms of taking hunger off the table and replacing it with food security.
Yeah, because it sounds like some of our traditional answers have been food distribution. How do we just move food where it needs to be? But what you're talking about is something much, much deeper than that.
Yes, absolutely. And I won't gloss over the fact that food security is an access problem. So that means that we have to be better and more professional and reach a higher level of excellence in what we do, in the distribution of food and getting food to the people who need it. Okay, so that's one side of it. Now let's talk about it in the context of where hunger really lies in society. Because when you take on hunger, as a friend of mine, a fellow philosopher, said to me, you'll get poverty, structural racism, housing, vocational training, and education all for free. So we have to look at that differently. We have to see hunger differently. And what we're doing is we're asking ourselves, who wins when we win? And you'll find your natural partners there.
And interestingly enough, and I've got to make sure our listeners understand this, we're in your workroom.
Yes.
In your workroom are a number of flip sheet papers that are all up on the wall. I was reading them before you came in, and one of them says exactly what you just said as a statement. And my guess is you keep these worksheets up as constant reminders to yourself, your staff, your environment, as to what you're working on.
Yes, absolutely. And from these statements, Mike, you glean principles. And from those principles, you arrive at values. Now, those are the non-negotiables of how you're going to do this work. When I was younger, I used to think there were a lot of values. There were a lot of things that you needed to die on the hill for. Values, non-negotiables. Now I think there's few.
And there in fact lies why simplify is the third step in the reinvention process.
Yes.
Because when you really drill down to understanding your real keys, it isn't the hundreds that it could be. But for you, with a knowledge-based board, you're coming with needing to kind of facilitate all of that knowledge into those core key principles that we can all agree to, which will be the fuel that will allow us to accomplish what our goals are.
Absolutely. So you there's got to be this disruption. Has to be. Then somebody's got to own it. Okay, so that's me. That's us. That's the Food Bank Council of Michigan. And then to simplify, even for the professionals, let alone the general public, we have to simplify that. And here's how we did that. We simply say that if you're hungry, you only have one problem. You're only thinking about, what am I going to eat today and what am I going to feed my kids?
And if I understand the importance of that, when I go over here to one of your other charts, which is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, That is at the core root
That is
of
it.
every single biological being.
That's that exactly, and that's why physiological on Maslow's hierarchy of need is first. If we can take care of hunger and make this state food secure, imagine the economic impact.
And what's interesting is of the 3 top industries in this state, agriculture is one.
Sure.
And is a state surrounded by the greatest body of fresh water, I believe, in the world.
Yes. Lake Superior is the largest, Lake Victoria being second. And then here we come with Lake Michigan. And
So when you go back to the physiological needs biologically, which is water and food,
right.
you are uniquely poised in an environment to really make a difference in this work that you're doing.
Absolutely.
But one of the ways that that we have to magnify that energy, so you have yourself who's owning it, and you have a board of directors who you're facilitating that energy and getting them to make decisions surrounding whatever that focus is. I'm curious to know then how you bring your employees in to understand that you've changed the conversation, that you are reinventing the conversation.
Yes.
And their role in owning this hunger question, which, for your organization, for somebody else's organization, it would be different. How are you pulling your employees in?
So the byproduct of this process of the reinvention process is that you have the opportunity to create a culture. And that culture is what drives your employees. And culture for me is probably the strongest force on the planet, but also the most delicate.
So talk about how you're focused to the employees in culture orientation rather than maybe on hunger orientation.
Right.
How that shift in thinking for a leader.
So
you manage that careful, because you're talking about being fragile.
Right. It is. When you're trying to create a very positive, mission-driven culture, conflict resolution, those kind of things can disrupt in a negative way.
Yes.
And so we have to have those principles aligned. So here in our culture, we are mission-driven. We talk about it every day. There's not a day that goes by that we don't talk about creating a food secure mission. So now everybody's actions, reactions, their decisions are all within that frame of something that is much bigger and will last much longer than I do. So they will walk out the door today, whatever time that they leave, and they will have a question in their mind. Sometimes it's written on their desk. I'll leave them a note or send them an email and say, what did you do today to move the mission forward?
So you're constantly reminding them of that, so that they're constantly always in their mind knowing that you are thinking about them and their role in moving this forward.
Absolutely. They are so brilliant at what they do that it allows me to do what I do.
What would be very interesting for everybody that's listening to this, including myself, is do we plant on a regular basis those reminders? Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure you're not saying it in a harping or in a nagging way, but just as a curious reminder, help me understand how you were able to help move this forward.
Well, in the most negative sense, let's say that there's a conflict and that needs to be resolved among the staff. That's done within the context of the mission.
The mission then becomes the answer.
Absolutely. Every time. Because what you two might be fussing about over here, she got my pen or he got my pencil or whatever this middle school argument might be, is that bigger than the mission? And why are we wasting our time, energy, and emotion on who got whose pencil when there's children out here 22% of the children in Michigan who don't have enough food today? We don't have arguments about pencils, but we have a process in place that is guided solely by the mission, because nothing or no one is bigger than the mission here. And that's the culture driver.
Let's talk about the marketplace. How is the marketplace responding to your new changing the conversation?
So that will be manifest when we have created the personal will, that would be among the masses, and the political will among the decision makers to solve hunger. So that's where we're at.
Well, that's a big dance.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. But it doesn't get done without them.
But it sounds like what you're really talking about is creating new partnerships.
Yes, organically.
You're talking about organically creating new models for partnerships, for decision making, all around the focus of, are we solving the one key question?
Exactly.
But aligning your resources in different ways and having partnerships produce different things.
You can't scale this. You can't scale charity to this problem.
And I don't understand what that means.
You can't raise enough money from the benefactors.
This is not this. I think what you just said is there's not enough money in the world to solve this problem just by throwing money at it.
No, it won't work. And you can't scale. You can't raise enough money like a traditional nonprofit.
So you're watching the trends and the realities that are happening in the marketplace, and your job is to constantly figure out how to create new partnerships. So this is not do we have enough money? Do I have enough staff to combat this? This is how do I align all the resources in the world that really and truly intentionally want the same thing, but maybe haven't been aligned yet. And you become a master facilitator at making sure everybody who's got a vested interest in this party is aligned in this clear focus.
And then money's not an issue. Resources won't be an issue.
Money will follow.
Absolutely.
The money will be where it needs to be. But if that's the number one priority, you haven't done what you said at the beginning you needed to do, which is to change the conversation to get the core. You got to get the core fundamental reason back on the center of the table, not the symptoms.
Right, not symptoms.
And how many leaders focus more on symptoms and not on the organic reason why?
Right. I think so. I think you're spot on.
This has been a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful interview. Thank you, Phil. Global leader with a global perspective.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
You know, Mike, I love the question that Phil leaves his team with every day. What did you do to move the mission forward?
I think that is an incredibly simple yet powerful message to constantly remind people of what they're there for.
What a way to keep your eye on the prize and get over those petty arguments. Use the pencil example. I doubt that they're that petty in his office, but it's really saying we've got bigger fish to fry.
Absolutely. And I know at the core, Phil has embraced that concept throughout the organization because he is the perfect example of somebody that gets very tired of working on solutions to symptoms and indeed wants to work on solutions to core issues. And so he's always interested in going back to ask the question, why? Why is this happening? Why is this happening? Why is this happening?
They keep what they want to achieve in front of them. You said you were sitting in a meeting room with Phil, and they had all these notes on the walls about where they were going and what their mission was.
Everywhere we looked on the meeting room wall were the notes that they had used to create, I'm sure, are their initiatives. And because the story of their discussion, which I'm sure has an action plan attached to it, is constantly a reminder that this team is what we have talked about. This is what we agreed to. This is what keeps our focus. And this all has to translate back to the core reason we're sitting here working on this initiative.
It made me think of Drew Mitchell's interview for the Clinton County Economic Alliance. She also keeps that one pager in front of her and goes back to that and lets that drive her. How important is that? I mean, we can't really stress enough how important it is to keep that in front of you.
Well, Misty, it's important enough that we made it one of the 5 steps in the reinvention process, that focus on simplification. For some reason, we think that the manifesto that is written has to be so lengthy. And people just can't comprehend that scope. Now, credit to you if you have the ability to write a manifesto. But for most of us, we just need to know those key core issues that are driving the rest of the story. And I think it's very much an art for a leader to be able to distill down all of that clutter into some very distinct, simple understandings that we focus on.
So he's driven that through his core culture at work, in the office, with his team. It's very clear, and it sounds amazing. And like we mentioned in the beginning of this interview, he's done it with his board, too.
One of the very interesting things that Phil mentioned with his board, which I think is very different than some of what other board members have, or how other board of directors are set up. Phil's board is made up of other people like him who have intimate understanding of the marketplace they're working in.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So in most boards, the executive director spends a lot of time in education and educating the board on what is going on as opposed to what should be going on. And for Phil, since their board is made up of people who are regional people within the industry, he doesn't need to work on the educational part. They bring that with them. What they spend time with is, what are we going to do about this? And for Phil to answer the what are we going to do about this, you have to go back and ask the core key question, why? And so it's a very different dynamic, and it really has forced that executive to move away from the education that many times goes on in board meetings to implementation of very strategic objectives that is typically maybe not always as prevalent as it should be in a boardroom.
I liked what Phil said about creating opportunities. What we're in the business of is creating opportunities so we can get better at what we do. So when we win, they meaning his customer.
In many of our podcasts, we've really been expressing how important it is that we listen to the marketplace and listen to our customers and listen to our members. And I think that's really what Phil is talking about, is at the operational level, it's really our role to open new doors. Sometimes we think it's our job to just continually go in circles, kind of like, if you think about it, Misty, kind of a revolving door that just goes around and around and around and around, yet you don't really go anywhere. Now think, for example, if you're the executive director and your job is not only to open one door, but then where's the second door, the third door, the fourth door? And that's hopefully what we would call progress. If those doors, which are opening, are leading to a key strategic objective, then yes, your goal is to open those doors, to navigate those hallways, and to get to a destination that, in many ways, as we've talked, is in a very dynamic state right now within the world we live in.
So Phil mentioned that he is an avid listener of our podcasts. Thank you, Phil, for that shout out. But he must be catching on, because he was able to distill what they're doing in their office that aligns with our 5 fundamentals. For Phil to so easily be able to adapt his conversation to the pure reinvention model suggests to me that not that what we're talking about is necessarily new, but it may be just different. And there are core key people out there like Dr. Knight who are living the pure reinvention model. So it's really fun to be able to have a conversation with those individuals, because we're not talking about what is it, we're talking about how to use it. Well, and it's something we've said before, but I think it bears repeating. It's not that this is brain surgery, but it's the fact that we've given you a model. So these 5 fundamentals of reinvention that you can really apply to your life. And they're open-ended enough that they can make sense to you and you can take ownership. Because at the core, it's about taking ownership and making it your lifestyle. I think for every single episode, if as a listener, if you can just perhaps stimulate your thought to a key fundamental that makes sense to you, and then you apply in your application process something that's unique and special to you. Our goal is to set up the core, why, and to give you some thought as to the key steps, and then let you have the freedom and the flexibility to personalize that journey specific to you. So if you guys out there have ways that you are seeing that in your work lives or trying to make pure reinvention model work at home professionally, share it with us. We love having more examples of this, and we'd love to talk to you and have you on our show. Email us at hello@purereinvention.com or shoot us a line on social media, Twitter @PureReinvention or Facebook. If you're ready for a change, make it a change that lasts. Make it Pure Reinvention.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new podcasts are up by following us on Twitter @PureReinvention or sign up for our mailing list at PureReinvention.com.